This trash isn't worth $1. Those 7 words landed like a fist against the chest of a 19-year-old girl standing alone at the front of a studio classroom, and the sound of laughter that followed them, easy, careless, the kind of laughter that cost the laugher nothing, and the laughed at everything, would echo inside Amara Reed for years to come. She had spent 3 sleepless nights hunched over her desk in the Bronx apartment she shared with her mother. A $20 set of charcoal pencils worn down to stubs. A single desk lamp throwing amber light across a face she had studied her entire life, trying to capture what words had never been enough to say. The drawing hit the floor before she could blink. Then came the sound nobody forgets, the clean, deliberate tear of paper splitting in two, and the classroom fell into a silence that was almost worse than the laughter. Because silence means everyone saw, everyone understood, and nobody moved. 2 torn pieces drifted to the linoleum like wounded birds. Amara did not cry. She stood very still, the way a person stands when the world has just proved something they had always feared but hoped wasn't true. What no one in that room could have known, not the laughing students, not the professor with the scissors still in her hand, not even Amara herself, was that a retired curator, standing in the hallway outside, had paused at the door, had seen the drawing in the moment, before it was destroyed, and had felt something shift in his chest that hadn't shifted in 20 years. The Hargrove Institute of Fine Arts occupied 4 floors of a converted textile building on West 57th Street in Manhattan, the kind of address that appeared in the bios of artists whose names were carved into museum lobbies. Its floors were polished concrete. Its windows were floor to ceiling. Its waiting list for the advanced studio program stretched 18 months, and the tuition, $32,000 per semester, quietly ensured that the students who populated its light-filled classrooms came from a very specific kind of world. Amara Reed did not come from that world. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx, where the radiator clanked all winter and the window faced a parking structure. And she had learned to draw because drawing was free, because a pencil and a piece of paper asked nothing of her that she could not provide. She had won a scholarship, a full merit scholarship, the kind given out once every 3 years when someone on the admissions committee saw something they couldn't argue against, and she had accepted it quietly, without the celebration her mother had tried to organize, because Amara understood, even at 17, that getting in was only the beginning of a different kind of difficulty. She took the subway every morning, the 2 train from 3rd Avenue, transferring twice, arriving at the institute with charcoal already under her fingernails because she practiced on the ride down, sketching the faces of strangers who never knew they were being immortalized on the back of grocery receipts. She wore the same 3 sweaters on rotation and ate a peanut butter sandwich for lunch every day because the cafe in the student center charged $9 for a bowl of soup, and she had not yet learned to be comfortable watching other people spend money that casually. She was the only black student in the advanced portrait studio. She was, as far as she knew, one of 4 black students in the entire graduate program. She had a way of making herself small in the classroom, sitting near the back, speaking only when directly addressed, producing work that the other students sometimes noticed with a sidelong glance before turning away, because the quality of it made them uneasy in a way they didn't have words for. Her name was Amara, which in several languages means grace, or eternal, or one who is unfading. She would not have told you that if you asked. She barely spoke her own name out loud. Catherine Whitmore had been teaching at the Hargrove Institute for 19 years, long enough that her preferences had calcified into policies and her biases had been mistaken, over time, for taste. She was 53 years old, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously contradicted in a professional setting. She wore linen in winter and silk in summer, and had a habit of holding her chin slightly elevated when she walked through the studio, as though the air near the ceiling was cleaner than the air everyone else breathed. She had published 2 books on color theory and given a TED Talk about the democratization of modern art that had been watched, according to her bio, over 800,000 times. The talk was good. The books were thorough. Her teaching, however, was something different from what it claimed to be. In the studio, Whitmore moved through the room like a current warming the students she favored, cooling the ones she had already decided were not worth her energy. She had decided about Amara on the first day of the semester, approximately 4 minutes after Amara had taken her seat. The decision had no single articulated reason. It never does. It was the kind of decision that arrives pre-formed, wrapped in the language of aesthetic standards and professional discernment, dressed up so thoroughly in the vocabulary of expertise that the person making it can almost convince themselves it has nothing to do with what it very clearly has everything to do with. She looked at Amara's setup, the inexpensive paper, the worn down pencils, the careful, economical way the girl arranged her space, and something in Whitmore's face closed like a shutter. From that moment forward, Amara Reed was invisible, or worse than invisible. She was an inconvenience, a scholarship student who had gotten into a room she didn't belong in, and who would, Whitmore seemed to believe, eventually figure that out and leave. The favorite was a student named Brittany Sinclair, who came from Greenwich, Connecticut, and whose father sat on the board of two Manhattan galleries. Brittany was talented, genuinely talented, with a loose, confident line, and an instinct for color that many students twice her age hadn't developed. But her talent was not why she was Whitmore's favorite, and everyone in the room understood this at a molecular level, even if no one said so. Whitmore selected Brittany's work for the fall group show. She pulled Brittany aside after class for private conversations about technique that lasted half an hour. She mentioned Brittany's name in a profile piece for an arts magazine as an emerging voice to watch. When other students produced work that impressed her, Whitmore's praise was measured, professional, proportionate. When Brittany produced work that impressed her, something lit up behind the professor's eyes that resembled genuine emotion. The classroom had its hierarchies, as all classrooms do, and Brittany stood at the top of them. And below her were the students with gallery connections and summer programs, and parents who collected art, and below them were the ones without those things. And at the very bottom of the informal, unspoken ranking was Amara Reed, who had none of those advantages and who painted, in Whitmore's privately held opinion, as though she had something to prove. The worst part was not the favoritism itself. The worst part was the way the other students absorbed Whitmore's contempt and reproduced it in their own behavior, in the way they turned slightly away when Amara spoke during critique, in the way they chose partners for projects, in the way laughter moved through the room when Whitmore made one of her soft, cutting remarks about working class sentimentality, or unrefined emotional excess remarks that had no named target, but always, somehow, landed in the same direction. Amara noticed all of it. She noticed it, and she said nothing. And she kept drawing, because what else was there to do? Dorothy Reed worked 2 jobs. She cleaned offices 5 nights a week for a commercial cleaning company that paid $14 an hour and provided no benefits, and she worked Saturday and Sunday mornings at a laundromat on Willis Avenue that smelled of bleach and warm lint, and where the owner, a kind elderly man named Mr. Farouk, let her take home the unclaimed clothes at the end of the month. She had been doing this for 11 years, since Amara's father left, and she was 44 years old and looked 60, not in a cruel sense, but in the specific way that labor writes itself onto a body, the way exhaustion settles into the corners of the eyes and the lines around the mouth, and the particular way a person holds their shoulders when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She did not complain. This was not because she had nothing to complain about, but because she had decided early on that complaining was a luxury, like sleep, that she could not afford. She came home at 6 in the morning and made Amara's lunch before waking her, and she was asleep by 7:30, and she woke up again at 3 in the afternoon. And in the hours between waking and leaving for the night shift, she cooked dinner and went over the bills and asked about school with an attentiveness that never wavered, never showed its own exhaustion, because the one thing Dorothy Reed refused to allow was for her daughter to feel like a burden. Amara had drawn her mother hundreds of times. Quick sketches on napkins, careful studies in her sketchbooks, abstract compositions where her mother appeared only as a posture or a quality of light. But she had never made something that felt adequate to the reality of the woman. In October of that year, the semester already half over, the scholarship review coming up in the spring, the pressure of needing to produce something significant settling over her like weather, Amara decided to try again. She set up her workspace at the kitchen table late on a Thursday night after her mother had left for work. She had two pieces of good paper, the expensive kind, 90-pound cotton rag that she had been saving. She took out her best charcoals. She put a photograph of her mother on the table, taken the previous Christmas. Her mother smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes, wearing a cardigan she'd owned for 15 years. Amara looked at the photograph for a long time without drawing. Then she began. She worked for 3 nights straight. She slept in 2-hour intervals on the couch, waking to draw for another 4 hours, going to class in a fog, coming home and drawing again. She was trying to do something she had never attempted before, which was to paint not how her mother looked, but how her mother was the specific quality of a love that expressed itself as sacrifice, the tenderness that lived inside exhaustion, the dignity that survived circumstance. She drew every line in her mother's face as though it were a sentence in a language she was only now learning to read. The bags under the eyes, the slight asymmetry of the mouth. The hands, she spent almost one entire night on the hands. Those broad, capable, worn down hands that had made 10,000 lunches and scrubbed 10,000 floors and still, somehow, managed to hold Amara's face gently whenever she was sick. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she had made, and she felt something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it, a sense of having told the truth, maybe for the first time, in the medium she had been practicing since she was 8 years old. It was the best thing she had ever made. She knew it the way you know certain things about yourself, not from logic but from the body, from the quiet certainty that arrives when something is exactly right. She brought it to class on a Tuesday morning, rolled carefully in a cardboard tube. She had never before brought work to class with hope. This time, for the first time in 4 months at the Hargrove Institute, she allowed herself to feel something like hope. Whitmore moved through the critique the way she always did, stopping at each easel with a considered expression, delivering her assessments with the careful selectivity of someone who always knows exactly which word will land hardest. She praised Brittany's new oil study, called it assured, called it formally intelligent. She spent 8 minutes at the easel of a boy named Philip, whose work she found competent but derivative, and she told him so in exactly those terms, with a gentleness that softened the critique into something bearable. She spent approximately 45 seconds at the easel of the student next to Amara. Then she turned, and her eyes fell on Amara's charcoal portrait, and something happened in her face that Amara had not seen there before. Not contempt exactly. Something that looked, briefly, like surprise, and then, almost immediately, something that looked like anger. Whitmore lifted the portrait off the easel. She held it at arm's length. The classroom waited. "Who is this supposed to be?" she said, and her voice had a quality in it that was different from the voice she used for ordinary critique. Flatter, colder, with an edge that the students all felt, but couldn't quite name. Amara said, quietly, that it was her mother. Whitmore turned the portrait slightly, as though examining it from a new angle. "The composition is maudlin," she said. "The sentiment is unearned. This looks like a greeting card for people who've never seen real art." She paused. "This is the kind of work we expect from a first-year hobbyist, not a scholarship student in advanced studio." The laughter started slowly, in the back of the room, where the cruelest things always start. Amara looked at the portrait in Whitmore's hands, her mother's face, her mother's hands, the thing she had made in 3 sleepless nights, out of love, and something rose up in her chest that surprised her. She said, "You don't know what you're looking at." The classroom went silent in a new way. Whitmore looked at her. The expression that crossed the professor's face was not anger, not yet it was something colder and more calculated, the expression of someone who has just been given permission to do what they had already been planning to do. She set the portrait back on the easel. She went to her desk. She came back with a pair of scissors. She picked up the portrait. She cut it straight down the middle, cleanly, deliberately, the way you cut something when you want the act to mean something, and she let both halves fall to the floor. "That," she said, "is my assessment." She walked to the next easel. The class followed her. Nobody looked at Amara. Nobody said a word. The two halves of Dorothy Reed's portrait lay on the linoleum floor, face up, the charcoal hands nearly touching at the torn edge. The basement of the Hargrove Institute was technically a storage facility, though it had accumulated over decades into something more complicated. A maze of framed canvases wrapped in brown paper, crates of plaster casts, the accumulated equipment of 100 semesters. Near the back, past a row of storage lockers, there was a workshop. And in the workshop, for reasons that had to do with a facilities dispute from 4 years earlier that had never been fully resolved, an elderly man named Theodore Bennett had been given use of a corner space with a work table and a set of fluorescent lights and access to the Institute's conservation supplies in exchange for occasional consulting work. Bennett was 71 years old and had spent 40 years as a conservator and restoration specialist, most recently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, before retiring to what turned out to be a restlessness he hadn't anticipated. He was thin, deliberate in his movements, with white hair and the slightly chemical smell of a person who has worked with solvents all their life. He had come to the Institute's basement because it gave him something to do, and because he found young artists in their unguarded early years more interesting than most of the professional artists he had spent his career working around. He had been organizing a set of 19th century prints when Amara came through the basement door carrying two torn pieces of paper against her chest, her face entirely composed, in a way that cost her considerably more than composure usually costs. She sat down at an empty work table. She put the pieces flat on the surface. She did not cry, and she did not speak, and she looked at the torn halves of her mother's face with an expression that Bennett, from across the room, recognized immediately because he had seen it many times in his career on the faces of people who had just watched something irreplaceable be destroyed. He came over. He looked at the work for a long time, without speaking. Then he sat down across from her and said, in a voice that held no pity and no performance, only the particular gravity of someone saying something they mean absolutely, "This is extraordinary." He told her his name. She told him hers. He asked if he could repair it. She looked at him for a moment, this old white man in a basement full of old things, offering her something she hadn't asked for, and then she said yes. What Bennett did not tell her immediately, because the time for it hadn't yet come, was that he had known someone from her family once, a long time ago. He had met a woman named Ruth, an artist who worked in charcoal and mixed media in the early 1980s, when both of them were young and the art world was a different country than it is today. Ruth had been Amara's grandmother. She had died before Amara was born, her work largely unrecognized, her canvases stored in a relative's garage in the Bronx. Bennett had thought about Ruth occasionally over the years, in the particular way you think about someone whose talent you recognized and whose recognition never came, with a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a name. Now he sat across from Ruth's granddaughter and looked at the torn portrait and felt the weight of decades in his chest, like something he was only now being asked to put down. Bennett worked on the restoration for 6 days. He used Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste for the physical repair, matching the texture of the original paper so precisely that from more than 2 feet away, the tear was invisible. But the repair was only part of what he did. He also, carefully, with the cotton-tipped tools of his trade and the decades of knowledge behind his hands, brought out what the charcoal had been doing, that perhaps even Amara hadn't fully understood herself, the way the light in the portrait seemed to come from inside the subject, rather than falling on her from outside, the way the hands held a quality of motion even in stillness, as though caught in the act of reaching rather than posed. He cleaned the surface of smudges Amara had been unable to avoid in 3 nights of working. He mounted it on archival board. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it for a long time, and then he called a woman named Sylvia Park. Sylvia Park was 62 years old and had been a senior curator at the Whitney Museum for 14 years before founding her own curatorial consultancy, which specialized in identifying and developing the careers of underrepresented artists. She had known Bennett for 30 years. She trusted his eye without reservation. She came to the basement on a Thursday afternoon and stood in front of the restored portrait for 4 minutes without speaking, which, for Sylvia Park, was unusual. She had built a career on fast and confident assessments, on the ability to walk through a gallery and know within seconds what mattered and what didn't. 4 minutes of silence was a form of respect she offered rarely. Then she said, "Who made this?" Bennett told her. She asked to meet Amara. The meeting happened 2 days later, in Bennett's basement workshop, with the portrait propped on his work table between them. Park asked Amara about the subject, about the process, about her training. She asked, with the particular directness of someone who is not performing interest but feeling it. At the end of the conversation, she made an offer. She wanted to submit the portrait for inclusion in a national juried exhibition called The Human Document, which would open at the Smithsonian in Washington the following spring and then travel to 6 other institutions over the course of 2 years. Amara sat very still for a moment. Then she asked carefully, what that would mean. Park told her. Amara said yes. The Human Document opened on a Thursday in late March to what the Washington Post would later describe as extraordinary critical attention. The show featured 42 works by 38 artists, and it was Amara's portrait listed in the catalog simply as Mother, 2 a.m. Charcoal on cotton rag, 23 by 30 inches that the critics kept returning to. A reviewer for the New York Times wrote that the work stopped her in the middle of the gallery, the way very few works of art had stopped her in 20 years of looking, that it had something in it that was both utterly specific, the face of one woman, her exhaustion, her love, and utterly universal, the way certain true things are universal not because they are abstract, but because they are so precisely, irreducibly particular. A critic for Art Forum used the word devastating twice in a single paragraph. The story of the work began to circulate not through any effort of Amara's, who was in New York working on a new series and was largely unaware of what was happening, but through the quiet, viral logic of things that matter. Someone wrote a piece about the portrait for an online arts publication. Someone else found out that the artist was 20 years old and on a merit scholarship and had made the piece after 3 sleepless nights. Someone found out about the charcoal pencils worn to stubs, about the subway rides from the Bronx, about the mother who worked nights and still made her daughter's lunch every morning before going to sleep. The story spread. Within 3 weeks of the opening, the portrait had been written about in publications in 6 countries. It had been reproduced legally, with permission from the curator, in the cultural sections of 4 national newspapers. The story of the work was the story of the work, a daughter's love, made visible, that had survived an act of deliberate destruction, and that had arrived, finally, where it had always deserved to be. Catherine Whitmore saw the coverage on a Monday morning while drinking coffee at her desk, and the coffee cup paused halfway to her mouth, and for a long moment she sat very still, and in that stillness, the architecture of something she had believed, for 19 years, was secure, began to make a sound. Whitmore moved fast, which was a mistake. People who move fast under panic tend to reveal the thing they are trying to conceal, and what Whitmore revealed over the course of 8 days of escalating action was a set of fears that, once visible, looked nothing like the confidence she had spent 2 decades projecting. She first made a statement, through the Institute's communications office, suggesting that the portrait had been substantially improved through the restoration process, and that the quality that critics were responding to might owe more to Theodore Bennett's conservation work than to the original student. Artwork. The statement was carefully worded, technically deniable, and immediately transparent to anyone who had spent any time thinking about what conservation work actually does and does not do. Bennett, when asked about it, said 3 sentences: that he had repaired a torn piece of paper, that he had made no alterations to the original marks or composition, and that in 40 years of conservation work, he had never encountered a technique that could introduce genius into a work that didn't already contain it. Then Whitmore contacted a lawyer, a man named Gerald Frame, who specialized in intellectual property and had a history of working for arts institutions in disputes over attribution. Frame sent a letter to the curatorial office of the Human Document claiming that the portrait, having been produced in the context of a Hargrove Institute studio course, might be subject to the Institute's intellectual property policies regarding student work. The letter was wrong on the merits. The Institute's policies were quite clear that student work remained the property of the student, but it was designed not to win, but to slow things down, to create uncertainty, to make the people involved second guess what they were doing. It created instead a different effect. Investigative reporters, drawn to the story by the extraordinary attention the portrait was receiving, began asking questions about Whitmore's teaching record, about the incident in the studio, about the classroom culture at the Hargrove Institute more broadly, about whether there were other students who had experienced what Amara had experienced. There were several of them, once the first story appeared, came forward with their own accounts of dismissal, of disparagement, of the subtle, consistent exclusion of students who didn't fit the profile. Whitmore had decided, privately, constituted real potential. One former student, a young man named Marcus from Baltimore, who had left the program after his first semester 4 years earlier, described a critique in which Whitmore had told him that his work had the energy of a community center mural, a phrase so deliberately calibrated to diminish, so precisely aimed at the specific intersection of race and class and institutional prestige that when he read it aloud to a reporter, it required no analysis. The picture that emerged over those weeks was not a portrait of a single bad moment in a single classroom. It was a portrait of a culture sustained over years that Whitmore had built and enforced and benefited from. The portrait, in its way, was also devastating. The auction was organized by Sotheby's and held on a Tuesday evening in November at their main sales room on York Avenue. Sylvia Park had suggested the sale, and Amara had agreed to it partly because of what the proceeds could do, and partly because she understood, without being told, that the public completion of the work's story, its restoration, its recognition, its formal entry into the market, as something of significant value would constitute a kind of ending that the story needed. The room held 300 people. There were additional bidders on telephone lines and through the online platform. The portrait was the 10th lot of the evening, following a group of mid-century works that sold steadily and well, and when it came up, the room had a particular quality of attention. The kind that happens when everyone present understands that they are in the room for the thing and not for everything else. The auctioneer opened bidding at $100,000. It reached $250,000 in the first 90 seconds. Theodore Bennett sat in the third row and did not bid but watched with the expression of a man who was witnessing the completion of something that began before the people in the room were born. Amara sat beside him, her hands in her lap, her face composed with the same careful stillness she had held in that classroom 11 months ago, watching the price rise with an equanimity that might have looked, from the outside, like indifference, but was in fact something closer to the profound calm of someone who has already survived the worst of it, and for whom everything that comes now is simply true. Catherine Whitmore was also in the room. She had come, and this would later be discussed and analyzed and written about at some length. She had come with a folder of documents, paper copies of class records, grading sheets, notes from studio sessions. She had told people before arriving that she had evidence, that she could demonstrate the portrait's true origins, that the public narrative had been distorted. What she had was a record of having assigned the portrait prompt that Amara had technically been responding to when she made the piece. It was the kind of argument that collapses on contact with common sense. The difference between assigning a musician to write a song and claiming authorship of the song they write. And when she produced the documents during a confrontation in the lobby with a journalist shortly before bidding began, the journalist simply looked at them and looked at Whitmore and said, "I'm sorry. Are you saying that because you told students to draw something meaningful, you own whatever meaningful thing they drew?" The documents went back in the folder. Whitmore went into the sales room. The bidding continued. At $500,000, 5 telephone bidders remained. At $900,000, 3. At $1.4 million, a final contest emerged between a private collector in London and a museum foundation in San Francisco, and the room watched this with the kind of silence that accumulates in spaces where something important is being decided. At $2 million exactly, the gavel came down. A sound moved through the room that was not quite applause and not quite a sigh, but something in between the sound of a conclusion being reached, of a long arc arriving at its destination. Whitmore stood up and walked toward the exit before the lot was announced, and the people who watched her go would later describe the quality of her departure differently. Some said she seemed diminished. Some said she seemed hollowed. One person said, simply, that she looked like someone who had just fully understood something she had been refusing to understand for a very long time. She left alone. The door closed behind her. The room turned back to the stage. The announcement of the sale price was followed by the kind of attention that changes things permanently. Within 24 hours, the story had been covered by every major news organization in the country, and by dozens of international outlets, and by a number of cultural critics who used it as a lens through which to examine something much larger than one classroom, one professor, one torn piece of paper, the systemic way that institutions of aesthetic authority determine what counts as talent and who gets to be seen, and whose work is allowed to accumulate the cultural permission to be called great. Amara gave 3 interviews, all brief, all precise. She did not perform gratitude or triumph. She spoke about her mother. She spoke about the work. She said, once, in a sentence that was repeated widely afterward, "I wasn't trying to make something important. I was trying to tell the truth about someone I love." Whitmore resigned from the Hargrove Institute 2 weeks after the auction, before the Institute's formal inquiry into her teaching conduct could be completed. The inquiry continued without her participation and produced a report that documented a pattern of conduct going back at least 10 years, with particular attention to the differential treatment of students by race and economic background. The Institute issued a public apology, reformed its scholarship program, and in a gesture that was widely noted for its symbolism, renamed the studio where the incident had occurred the Bennett Reed Studio, after the conservator and the artist. Theodore Bennett accepted the honor with the kind of dry, private humor of a man who has learned not to take institutions too seriously. He continued working in his basement space. He continued, as he had always done, noticing the students no one else was noticing. Brittany Sinclair, for her part, had a good career, her talent was real, and it found its own expression independent of the advantages it had been given, and she was gracious enough, in later years, to acknowledge publicly what the circumstances of their shared education had been. Some people grow. The story allows for that. Dorothy Reed quit her night shift job the week after the auction. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She simply didn't go back. On the Saturday morning, after Amara's share of the auction proceeds was transferred to the account Sylvia Park had helped her set up the portion after taxes and fees, still, a number with 6 figures in it, Amara came home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light, awake at 10 o'clock in the morning for the first time in 11 years, a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and on her face an expression that her daughter had been trying her whole life to draw. Amara sat down across from her. She didn't draw it. Some moments are not for capturing. They are for being inside. Amara Reed established the Root Foundation the following year, a scholarship and mentorship program for artists from low-income backgrounds, named for her grandmother Ruth, whose work now hangs in the permanent collection of 3 institutions that had no idea she existed a decade ago. The foundation funds tuition, materials, mentorship, and specifically, deliberately the kind of professional support and advocacy that talented people from disadvantaged backgrounds rarely receive, the assistance navigating the gatekeeping systems of the art world that talent alone cannot reliably overcome. It operates out of a rented space in the Bronx, 10 minutes by subway from the apartment where Amara grew up. It has funded, in its first 3 years of operation, 41 artists. Several of them have gone on to exhibition in national and international venues. One of them, a 17-year-old girl from Chicago who paints with house paint on reclaimed wood, has already been called, by a critic for a major arts magazine, one of the most striking new voices in American painting. Amara does not publicly take credit for finding her. She doesn't publicly take credit for much of anything. She makes her work. She shows up. She believes, because her life has made it impossible not to believe, that talent is distributed without regard to circumstance, and that the work of a just institution or a just person or a just system is not to create talent but to stop destroying it. The original portrait of Dorothy Reed now hangs in the permanent collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum on a wall in a room that gets good light in the afternoon. The wall text describes the work briefly: the artist's age when she made it, the medium, the subject, the story of its restoration. It does not describe what was done to it before the restoration. The work itself is sufficient. You can see, if you stand in front of it long enough, exactly what happened and what survived. The tear, if you look very carefully, is still there, a line so fine it is almost invisible, running straight down the middle of the composition, stopped and sealed, but not erased. The conservator made a choice, when he repaired it, to make the repair perfect, but not to make it disappear entirely. He said later that he thought the portrait deserved to carry its history, that a work of art which has been through something should be allowed to show that it has been through something, that the mark of what tried to destroy it was also part of what the work was. Real talent does not need permission to exist. This is a statement that sounds obvious until you consider how much of the world is organized around denying it, around building systems that require talent to seek permission, to prove itself to gatekeepers, to survive the verdict of people who benefit from the talent being unrecognized. Amara Reed's story is not, at its deepest level, about a professor who made a mistake or a classroom that failed a student. It is about the specific, ordinary, unremarkable cruelty of a world that looks at a 19-year-old girl from the Bronx making extraordinary work in a studio on West 57th Street and sees not the work, but the girl, and about what happens when the work survives anyway, not because the world became just, not because the gatekeepers relented, but because the work was true. And truth has a way, given time and the right set of eyes, of finding the place it belongs. The drawing did not change. From the moment Amara finished it on that third sleepless night at the kitchen table in the Bronx, the drawing was what it was: complete, sufficient, real. What changed was not the drawing. What changed was whether anyone was looking. And that, in the end, is the only question that ever really matters. Not whether the talent exists, but whether there is enough courage, enough decency, enough willingness to see in the people who hold the power to say so. There was, in this story, exactly one person with that courage in the room where it mattered most. He was an old man in a basement. He was holding a torn piece of paper. He looked at it for a long time, and then he decided, this deserves to be whole. There is a particular kind of injustice that wears the costume of expertise, and it is among the most difficult kinds to name, because the person committing it is usually very good at talking about art, or merit, or standards, and the language of authority wraps itself around the act so completely that the act becomes almost invisible. What Whitmore did to Amara that Tuesday morning was not simply unkind. It was a performance of power: the scissors, the deliberateness, the audience, the silence that followed, designed not merely to dismiss the work, but to demonstrate, publicly and irrefutably, that the person who had made it had no standing to object. The tearing of the portrait was a message, sent in the presence of witnesses, that the hierarchy was not merely in place but enforceable. And it was enforceable because the classroom had been prepared for it over months. The small exclusions, the soft mockeries, the way that Whitmore's contempt had been slowly, steadily distributed through the room until it had become the room's contempt, absorbed so naturally by the other students that most of them probably would not have described it as contempt at all. They would have described it as a sense of who belonged and who didn't. They would have described it as having good instincts about quality. The terrible efficiency of this kind of power is that it doesn't need to explain itself. It only needs to be repeated until it seems like nature. Amara understood this. She had understood it long before the scissors. What she had not understood, not fully, until Theodore Bennett sat down across from her in a basement and said without performance or pity that what she had made was extraordinary, was that the power was not. Finally, the last word. That underneath the entire architecture of the hierarchy, the admissions committees, the gallery connections, the linen suits and elevated chins and TED Talks about democratization underneath all of it, the work was either true or it wasn't. And if it was true, then the hierarchy's verdict on it was not an assessment, but an error. And errors, when they are large enough, when they are public enough, when they are witnessed by enough people, with enough willingness to be honest about what they are seeing, can be corrected. The correction, when it came, was not gentle. It was not meant to be gentle. The specific, public, documentable failure of Whitmore's judgment, the judgment of a woman who had spent 19 years positioning herself as the arbiter of artistic merit at one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, who had given a TED talk about democratization and simultaneously built a private feudal system inside her own classroom, was not something that could be absorbed quietly, reframed into a minor personnel matter and put away. It had happened in front of witnesses. The witnesses had dispersed into the world. The world, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this story, not because it was unusual, but because it was so perfectly legible, so precisely structured around the collision between what institutions claim and what they do, that it could not be misread. Every detail of it reinforced the next: the charcoal pencils worn to stubs, the scholarship, the subway, the mother working nights, the portrait made from love and sleeplessness, the scissors, the basement, the old man, who recognized a lineage the institution had never bothered to learn, existed, the restoration, the museum wall, the gavel, $2 million, arriving with the weight of a verdict delivered not by any judge or committee, but by the aggregate attention of people who had looked at the work and decided, collectively, that it was worth what it was worth, which was a great deal more than $1, and a great deal more than the opinion of a woman who had been measuring value with a ruler calibrated to serve her own convenience. The story spread because people needed it to spread, because the experience it described of being talented and unseen, of being assessed by someone whose assessment had nothing to do with the work, of having your own capacity diminished by an authority figure in a room full of people who said nothing, is not a rare experience. It is, for a very large number of people, a recognizable one. And when a story is recognizable, and also resolves the way this one resolved, people carry it with them. They give it to each other. They tell it to people who need to hear it. Not because it promises that things will always work out, but because it proves that the world's verdict on your talent is not the same thing as the truth about your talent. And the truth, if you protect it, if you keep making the work in the face of everything that tells you to stop, has a way of outlasting the verdict. Dorothy Reed visited the Smithsonian in January, on a free admission weekend, 4 months after the auction. She wore her good coat. She took the bus from the hotel where Amara had insisted on paying for the room, and she walked through the east wing of the museum with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman who has nowhere else to be and is choosing to take her time about it. And she found the room where the portrait hung, and she stood in front of it for a long time. A docent nearby offered to tell her about the work. Dorothy smiled and declined. She already knew the story. She stood there, and she looked at her own face, at the face her daughter had made from love, from charcoal, from 3 sleepless nights, at a kitchen table in the Bronx. And she thought about all the things she had never had time to think about what it meant to be seen, to be rendered visible by someone who loved you, with enough precision to capture not just how you looked, but what you were. The tear was there if you looked for it. She looked for it and found it. She stood there for a long time in the good afternoon light, and then she turned and walked back out into the day. The work remained. The work would remain after both of them were gone, which is the only claim that art can make that matters, and it is a large enough claim to justify everything: the sleepless nights, the worn down pencils, the subway rides, the years of being invisible, the one terrible morning when the thing you made with love was cut in two and dropped on the floor. All of it. It justifies all of it. Because in the end, what survived was not the portrait of a moment, and not the record of an injustice, and not even the proof of a talent that had been told it was worthless. What survived was a true thing. And true things do not need permission. They only need to last long enough for the right person to look. What Amara Reed became, in the years that followed, was not a symbol or a lesson, though the world had an appetite to make her both. She was an artist. She worked in charcoal and graphite and occasionally oil, and her subjects were consistently the people around her mother, her neighbors, the faces she encountered on the subway between the Bronx and wherever she was going, people whose lives had not yet been deemed significant enough to hang in a museum. She worked with the same unhurried precision she had always worked with, the same attentiveness to the thing beneath the surface, the same willingness to spend a night on a pair of hands if that was what the work required. Her second major exhibition opened 2 years after the auction at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, featuring 14 large scale charcoal works under the title Ordinary Extraordinary, and the review that appeared in the Los Angeles Times described the show as a quiet revelation, the kind that changes the way you see faces after you leave the gallery. She did not give many interviews. She did not cultivate a public persona or a presence designed to remind people that she existed. She showed up to her studio every day and made her work, and believed, as she had always believed, that the work would speak if it was allowed to, and she had learned more thoroughly than most people ever do that allowing it to speak was sometimes simply a matter of outlasting the people who were trying to stop it. She did not hate Catherine Whitmore. This surprised the journalists who asked about it, who expected a different answer, who had structured their questions around the assumption of a grudge. She had thought about it carefully and concluded that hate was not the right instrument for what Whitmore had been. Whitmore had been afraid of what Amara's talent implied about the adequacy of her own judgments, afraid of what it would mean to acknowledge the work's quality in a room where acknowledging it would cost her something. Fear made people cruel, and then made them stupid, and both the cruelty and the stupidity had already been addressed by history, and Amara had things to make. Hate would have required her to keep thinking about Whitmore. She had other things to think about. She thought about her mother. She thought about Ruth, her grandmother, whose paintings she had finally retrieved from the relative's garage and had spent 2 months cataloging with Bennett's help, discovering in them a lineage of vision and technique that she recognized in her own hands, the proof of something that had been trying to be seen for a very long time. She thought about the 41 artists her foundation had funded, and the 17-year-old in Chicago with the house paint and the reclaimed wood, and the next 41 after those, and the ones after them, the long, slow, patient work of building something that might mean that the next Amara Reed, whoever she was, wherever she came from, would not have to spend a semester being invisible before someone in a basement decided to look. That was the work she had chosen. The charcoal was one form of it. The foundation was another. They were the same gesture, finally, the insistence that what is true deserves to be seen, and that seeing it is not charity, but justice, and that justice, when it arrives not as a gift from the powerful, but as the inevitable outcome of truth, outlasting the lies told about it. This is what Amara Reed believed. This is what her life had taught her. This is what the portrait of her mother, hanging now in permanent collection in a room with good afternoon light, says without words to every person who stands in front of it long enough to really look.